There are mornings in this courthouse when the law feels like a wall, not a shield, not a foundation, a wall, cold, flat, and entirely indifferent to what's standing on the other side of it. This was one of those mornings. She walked in carrying flowers, wilted ones, the kind you grow yourself, in a garden you didn't plant, tended by hands that are no longer there to tend it with you. She was small, and she was quiet, and she sat in the last row like someone who had spent the past year trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. The charge was simple, cold. $293 for an expired license, points on the record, possible permanent suspension. The system had her exactly where it wanted her, and I almost let it have her. I almost called the next case. I almost let the machine do what machines do, process, assess, move on. Because that is what the docket asks of you, every single day, in every single courtroom in every city in this country. But there was something about the flowers. And when I asked her the one question that the law never thinks to ask, not what she did, but why, what she said next stopped the entire room. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was a revelation in the legal sense, because it was the most human thing I had heard in 23 years on this bench. I had a decision to make, and what I did next, not everyone agreed with it. Before we begin, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories about justice, empathy, and hidden truths move you, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. You won't want to miss what comes next. There are cases that walk into your courtroom and walk right back out. Cases you process the way a machine processes numbers, cleanly, efficiently, without remainder. And then there are cases that stay, cases that sit down somewhere behind your sternum and refuse to leave, even years later, even on the mornings when you think you've finally made peace with everything you've seen. This is one of those cases. I've been a judge for 23 years. Before that, I spent a decade as a public defender. Before that, I was a young man from a small town in Ohio who believed, with a sincerity that now embarrasses me slightly, that the law was the same thing as justice. I know better now. The law is a machine. Justice is what happens when a human being stands between the machine and another human being and refuses to step aside. On a gray Tuesday morning in October, I walked into courtroom 7 the way I always do. Coffee in hand, folder under my arm, the particular kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep. The heating system in that building has been malfunctioning since 2019, and on cold mornings it produces a sound somewhere between a groan and a sigh, as though the building itself is commenting on the proceedings. The fluorescent light above the clerk's desk had been flickering for 3 weeks. Nobody had fixed it. The smell of burnt coffee from the break room down the hall had soaked into the walls so thoroughly that I no longer noticed it. Until that morning, for some reason, I did. I noticed everything that morning. The courtroom was fuller than usual for a Tuesday. 11 cases on the docket. The gallery had that particular combination of people that you only ever see in places like this. The impatient, the frightened, the resigned, and the ones who've been here so many times the fear has turned into a kind of boredom. A young man in a delivery uniform was checking his phone. A woman in business attire was reviewing papers. A teenager sat between 2 adults who were very deliberately not looking at each other. And then, in the very last row, almost against the wall, sat Margaret Hollis. I didn't know her name yet. I only saw her the way you see a stranger in a room, as an impression, a silhouette, a detail that registers without explanation. Small, curved slightly inward, the way people curve when they're trying to take up less space than they're entitled to. A navy wool coat, the kind that had probably been good quality once, the cuffs slightly frayed at the edges. Her hair was gray and pinned back with what looked like the same kind of simple clip my mother used to wear. Her hands were folded in her lap around something I couldn't make out from the bench. She wasn't looking at anyone. That's the thing I remember most clearly about those first few minutes. The way her eyes were fixed at a point on the floor approximately 2 feet in front of her. Not vacant exactly, but absent. as though the most important part of her was somewhere else entirely, and only the body had shown up to court. I've learned in 23 years to read a room before I open it. Every person in that gallery was communicating something: anxiety, defiance, calculation, exhaustion. And the woman in the navy coat in the last row was communicating something too, quietly, in a language I recognized without being able to name it yet. She was somewhere she didn't know how to be. The clerk called the room to order. The fluorescent light flickered once, twice, held. The heating system groaned. I set down my coffee, opened my folder, and called the first case. Margaret Hollis was the fourth name on the docket. When the clerk called her, there was a pause, just a breath, just a second, before she stood. She gathered her things the way someone gathers themselves when the weight of simply existing has become a physical effort. She smoothed the front of her coat with one hand. She picked up what I could now see were flowers, a small bundle of white daisies, wilted, wrapped in clear plastic that crinkled softly as she stood. She walked to the front of the courtroom. Each step was careful, deliberate. Not the walk of someone performing their innocence for the room, and not the walk of someone bracing for a fight. It was the walk of someone who had simply run out of the energy required to walk any other way. She reached the stand. Her hands, small hands, the skin thin in the way that skin becomes when it has had decades of weather and work and winters, gripped the edge of the railing. Not tightly enough to whiten the knuckles, just enough to steady herself. I looked at her. She looked at the floor. And the heating system groaned again, and the fluorescent light held steady, and the room waited. 2312. The clerk read the charge in the flat, practiced tone that turns human circumstances into administrative language. Operating a motor vehicle with an expired driver's license. Violation code 14601.1. Cited on the morning of October 11th at the intersection of Briar Street and Holloway Avenue. Fine assessed, $293.47. Points to be added to the driving record. Failure to pay within 30 days would result in a formal review for permanent license suspension. $293. I watched her as the clerk read. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. The flowers in her hands trembled slightly, not from emotion, at least not visibly, but from the simple physical effort of holding something when your hands have decided they are tired. The prosecuting officer was a young man named Dennis Ray. Tall, well-pressed uniform, the particular posture of someone who has recently graduated from believing that doing the job correctly and doing the job well are the same thing. He presented the facts with efficiency. Vehicle observed stationary in a bus lane. Driver unable to produce a valid license upon request. License confirmed expired. 4 months and 11 days past its renewal date. Citation issued per standard protocol. Standard protocol. I've heard that phrase thousands of times from this bench. It is one of the most dangerous phrases in the English language, not because it is wrong, but because it is so perfectly, so completely right. Standard protocol is how systems function. It is also how systems fail people without anyone being responsible for the failure, because the protocol was followed, and the protocol is the thing, and the thing was done correctly, and so there is nothing to examine, and no one to answer for it. $293. I looked at the number on my docket sheet. Then I looked at the coat. Then I looked at the flowers. There is a version of this case that resolves itself in under 4 minutes. I have presided over that version hundreds of times. Charge is read, defendant confirms. Fine is assessed or payment plan is established. Gavel comes down. Next case. The machine processes the number. The number disappears into the system. The person disappears back into their life, or what remains of it. And the courtroom moves on because the courtroom always moves on, because the docket does not pause for the weight of individual circumstances. I could have done that. I picked up my pen. I set it back down. There was something about the flowers, not the fact of them. People bring strange things to court for reasons that range from the practical to the superstitious to the simply forgotten. But the way she was holding them, Not the way you hold something you've brought for a purpose, the way you hold something you cannot put down, the way you hold something that is the last physical object connecting you to a decision you made that morning when you got up and chose to keep going. I leaned forward slightly. The room was quiet in the way that courtrooms get quiet when they sense something is about to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the way air pressure shifts before weather changes. I said her name. She looked up. It was the first time our eyes met, and I will tell you something I have never said in any official proceeding. I have looked into a great many faces from this bench over 23 years, and most of them I have forgotten, the way you forget faces that the mind processes and files and moves past. I have not forgotten hers. I don't believe I will. She had brown eyes, dark and deep and exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix, the kind of exhaustion that has settled into a permanent address somewhere behind the irises. There were tears in them, not falling, not theatrical, just present, the way grief is present, quietly and without asking permission. I asked her if she understood the charge that had been read. She said, "Yes, sir," in a voice so small that the court reporter leaned forward slightly to catch it. I asked her if she had anything to say in her own defense. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked back down at the flowers for a moment as though consulting them. Then she said simply, "I didn't know it was expired." The young officer shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. The clerk's pen paused above his notepad. The woman in business attire in the gallery stopped reviewing her papers. I let the silence sit for a moment the way you let something settle before you pick it up. Because here is what 23 years on this bench teaches you. There are two kinds of people who say they didn't know. There are the ones for whom not knowing was a choice, a convenience, a selected blindness that protected them from accountability. And there are the ones for whom not knowing was simply the truth, not an excuse, not a strategy, just a plain and honest accounting of the facts as they experienced them. I knew, looking at her, which kind I was looking at. But knowing wasn't enough. Knowing is never enough in this room. In this room, the truth has to be spoken out loud into the record where the machine can hear it. So I set down my folder. I folded my hands. I looked at Margaret Hollis over the rim of my glasses, and I asked her the question that I already half knew the answer to, the question that I have learned in 2 decades of practice opens more doors than any legal argument ever has. I said, "Mrs. Hollis, why didn't you know?" She looked at me for a long moment. Not the look of someone calculating an answer, not the look of someone deciding how much to reveal or how to frame it, or what version of the truth would serve them best in this room. Just the look of someone who has been asked a question that reaches past the courtroom, past the charge, past the $293.47, and touches something so much older and so much larger that the simple act of being asked it in public is almost more than they can bear. She said, "Harold took care of all of that." 3 words, a name and a verb in the past tense. I said quietly, "Who is Harold?" And that was when she broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. She didn't collapse or sob or grip the railing until her knuckles went white. She simply dissolved is the only word I have for it. The way a person dissolves when the last wall they've been holding up finally decides it has done its job and steps aside. Her chin dropped, her shoulders came forward, the flowers shook in her hands, and 2 tears ran down her face with the quiet certainty of water that has been waiting a long time to fall. She said, "My husband. We were married 48 years. Were. Past tense." I didn't ask the next question immediately. I let the word sit in the room the way it deserved to sit. Were. 1 syllable carrying the full weight of a life that used to contain something it no longer does. After a moment, I asked her when she had lost him. She said, 1 year ago today. The courtroom went very still. I mean that in the most literal sense. The shuffling stopped, the papers stopped, the low background murmur that courtrooms generate the way rivers generate sound simply ceased, as though the room itself had decided to listen. Dennis Ray, the young officer standing to my left, had stopped looking at his notepad. He was looking at her. The woman in the business suit in the gallery had her papers in her lap, and her hands folded on top of them. Even the fluorescent light, which had been flickering intermittently all morning, had steadied. She told me, in that small, steady voice that was costing her everything to keep steady, that Harold had handled all of it. The car registration, the insurance, the utility bills, the tax filings, the license renewals. 48 years of administrative life, running invisibly in the background, managed by a man with calloused hands and a methodical mind who got up early and took care of things so that she never had to think about them. She told me she had spent the past 12 months learning, one document at a time, how to exist in a world that Harold used to navigate for her. She had learned to pay the electric bill online. She had learned to call the insurance company. She had learned that the garbage collection happened on Thursdays, not Wednesdays, because Harold had always taken it out the night before, and she had simply never needed to know the actual day. She had not known about the license. She found out when Dennis Ray tapped on her window, 2 blocks from Oak Hill Cemetery, with the wilted daisies on the seat beside her. I asked her what was in the cemetery. She lifted the flowers slightly without fully raising her eyes. She said, "I hadn't been back since we buried him. I couldn't. But today was a year, and I thought it was time. I grew these in the garden. He planted that garden 23 years ago. The daisies were his idea." I took off my glasses. I am not, by nature or by training, a man who takes his glasses off in the middle of proceedings. It is not professional. It is not impartial. It is precisely the kind of gesture that the law, in its idealized form, is not supposed to make. I took them off anyway. I pressed my fingers against my eyes for a moment, and I thought about a Friday morning 6 years ago, when I stood in front of a different grave in a different cemetery and told my wife, whose name was Catherine, that I would be back the following Friday, and the Friday after that, and every Friday for as long as I was capable of getting there. And I have kept that promise. Every Friday before I walk into this building, I stop at Oak Hill, the same cemetery 2 miles from this courthouse, and I leave a flower, and I stand there for a few minutes, and I remember. I put my glasses back on. I looked at Margaret Hollis, who was standing at the railing with 48 years of marriage and 1 year of grief, and a handful of daisies from her late husband's garden, 2 blocks from where she had been trying to go when the law stopped her. And I made my decision. I said, "Mrs. Hollis, in 23 years on this bench, I have fined people who deserved it, and I have fined people who didn't, and I have spent considerable time thinking about the difference. What I will not do, what I am not capable of doing this morning, is fine a woman for failing to renew a piece of paper while she was learning how to live without the person who used to renew it for her." I turned to the clerk. I said, "The court finds that the circumstances of this violation reflect an administrative lapse directly attributable to bereavement and the sudden assumption of sole household management following spousal loss. The fine is dismissed. The points will not be applied. Case closed." I reached into the inside pocket of my robe. I want to be precise about this moment, because it matters that you understand it was not a performance. There was no calculation in it, no thought of how it would appear or what it would mean, or whether it was the appropriate thing for a sitting judge to do. I simply reached into my pocket, took out my wallet, removed 3 folded bills, and handed them to the clerk. I said, "That's for the license renewal fee. See to it she has what she needs to get it processed today." The courtroom was silent. Then Dennis Ray, the young officer who had written the citation correctly and professionally and entirely by the book, cleared his throat once and looked at his shoes. I picked up my gavel. I looked at Margaret Hollis one last time. She was holding the daisies against her chest now, both hands, her eyes too full to speak. I said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "Go, Mrs. Hollis. Harold is waiting." The gavel came down. Thud. She left the courtroom the way she had entered it, quietly, carefully, without taking up more space than she felt she had the right to. But something had shifted in the quality of her stillness. When she had walked in, she was a woman carrying weight. When she walked out, she was a woman who had been, if only for a moment, relieved of some portion of it. Not all of it. Grief doesn't work that way. But some. I watched her go. Then I picked up my folder, called the next case, and the courtroom moved on, because courtrooms always move on, because the docket does not pause, because there were 7 more names and 7 more lives waiting to be heard that morning. The young man in the delivery uniform, the woman in business attire, the teenager between the 2 adults who weren't looking at each other. The machine kept running. But something had changed in the room. I could feel it the way you feel a change in temperature. Not dramatically, not all at once, but present and undeniable. People were sitting differently, listening differently. The particular armor that people put on when they walk into a courthouse, the defensive posture, the careful neutrality, the preparation for the worst, had softened just slightly around the edges, as though the room had been reminded that the people inside it were, in fact, people. Dennis Ray stayed for the remainder of the morning session. He didn't have to. His part in the proceedings had concluded the moment the case was dismissed. But he stayed, sitting in the second row, his notepad closed in his lap, watching the remaining cases with an expression I recognized as the particular look of a person revising something they previously believed to be settled. I didn't speak to him that day. I didn't need to. Some lessons don't require a lecture. Some things you simply have to watch happen and then sit with afterward and let do their work. I thought about Margaret Hollis on my drive home that evening. I thought about her the following Friday morning when I stopped at Oak Hill, the way I always do, and left my flower for Catherine. I stood there a little longer than usual. The October air was cold and smelled of leaves and distant wood smoke, and the particular melancholy of a season ending. I thought about a woman who had grown daisies in a garden her husband planted and driven 2 blocks with wilted flowers and an expired license and 48 years of love, and been stopped by the law at the exact moment she was finally ready to say goodbye. I thought, the law stopped her. And then, for one morning, the law let her go. 3 months later, in January, I received a letter. It was handwritten, on plain white stationery, in the careful, slightly unsteady cursive of a woman who had learned to write in an era when penmanship was taught as a form of discipline and respect. The envelope had been addressed to the courthouse. Someone on the administrative staff had forwarded it to my chambers with a small yellow sticky note that said simply, "Thought you should have this." Margaret Hollis wrote to tell me that she had renewed her license, that the woman at the DMV counter, a clerk named Rosa, she specified, because Margaret was the kind of person who remembered names, had recognized her from the news coverage that had, apparently, found its way onto a local television segment I had not been aware of. Rosa had waived the processing fee. She said it was the least she could do. Margaret wrote that she had made it to Oak Hill that same October morning after the courthouse, that she had been late. It was nearly noon by the time she arrived, but that Harold, she was fairly certain, would not have minded. She wrote that she had stood at his grave for a long time, that she had talked to him, that she had left the daisies, wilted as they were, because he had always said that flowers given with love arrive beautiful no matter what condition they're in. She wrote, "I think he would have liked you, Your Honor. He had no patience for cruelty and a great deal of patience for kindness. You reminded me of him a little." I read that line 3 times. I folded the letter and placed it in the top drawer of my desk, where I keep the things I am not willing to file away. As for Dennis Ray, I learned some months later through a colleague who knew him that he had begun volunteering on weekends at a grief support center 2 towns over. He had not announced it. He had not made it a story. He had simply quietly started showing up on Saturday mornings to sit with people who were learning to navigate a world that no longer contained someone they loved. I don't know if that morning in courtroom 7 was the reason. I don't know if there was a single reason, or many, or none that could be named. People change for reasons that don't always trace back to a single moment. But I know what I saw on his face when Margaret Hollis talked about Harold. And I know that some things, once seen, cannot be entirely unseen. That is the thing about this work that nobody tells you when you put on the robe for the first time. They tell you about the law. They tell you about precedent and procedure and the weight of impartiality. They do not tell you that the most important thing you will ever do in a courtroom may have nothing to do with the law at all. that sometimes the most important thing is simply to stop, to look, to ask one more question when the docket is telling you to move on, to be, for a moment, a human being rather than a mechanism, and to trust that the room will hold it. Margaret Hollis came to that courthouse to be processed. She left having been seen. I have thought about that distinction every day since, because here is what 40 years in law have taught me, distilled to its simplest form. The law is what we built to protect each other. But it only works, it only means anything, when the people operating it remember that the person standing in front of them is not a case number, not a violation code, not a line item on a docket. They are someone's Harold. They are someone's Catherine. They are a person who got up that morning and chose to keep going, and walked into a room full of strangers, and trusted, however reluctantly, that something in that room might still be on their side. Be that something. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone you love or someone you've lost, or something you've been carrying a little too long on your own, then you already understand what I've spent a lifetime trying to say from this bench. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to sit in this courtroom again, to hear the next case, the next person, the next moment where the law and the human heart are forced to negotiate with each other, then stay close. There are more files on this desk, and every single one of them belongs to someone who walked in hoping that justice today might look a little like grace. Court is adjourned. If this story stayed with you, take just a moment and ask yourself honestly, is there someone in your life, someone you love, someone you depend on, who quietly handles the things you never have to think about? And have you told them lately what that means to you? And when was the last time you were the one who stopped? When every system, every schedule, every rule said keep moving, and chose to ask one more question instead. Because Margaret didn't need a miracle that morning. She needed one person to look past the paperwork and see a woman who was simply trying to say goodbye. Tell us in the comments, your stories, your thoughts, the person this reminded you of. We read every single one. And if you believe in stories about compassion, quiet courage, and the kind of justice that looks like grace, make sure you're subscribed. There's always another file on this desk, and every one of them belongs to someone worth hearing.